Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. This time in political economy we're gonna talk about feudalism. This is a really big topic and a big chapter, so I might have to do this in multiple parts. But if that's the case, then each part should still be mostly self-contained, so you don't need to watch all the parts just back to back, right after each other. So feudalism as an economic system existed in one form or another in almost all countries. The textbook says, quote, "The era of feudalism covers a long period. In China, the feudal system existed for more than 2,000 years. In Western Europe, feudalism covers a number of centuries, from the time of the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the bourgeois revolution in England in the 17th century and in France in the 18th century. In Russia from the 9th century to the peasant reform of 1861, in Transcaucasia from the 4th century to the 70s of the 19th century, among the peoples of Central Asia from the 7th or 8th centuries right up to the victory of the proletarian revolution in Russia. In Western Europe, feudalism arose out of the breakdown of Roman slave-owning society on the one hand and the decay of the tribal system of the conquering tribes on the other. It was established as a result of the interaction of these two processes." Unquote. So, as was already said, elements of feudalism had already originated in slave-owning society in the form of the system of colony, which I talked about last time. The colony were people who were forced to work on the land of the landowner and to pay rent and fulfill various types of responsibilities, and they were not allowed to leave or move around, and they basically turned into serfs. So the slave-owning system of Rome collapsed. The invading tribes of Germans, Gauls, and Slavs and other peoples destroyed the Roman Empire. The latifundia farms and the handicrafts workshops based on slavery broke down. The slaves became colony, and the slave owners became large landowners. The conquering tribes, which defeated Rome, still had a tribal communal system, which was, however, in decline, as they were also entering the period of full-blown class society. These barbarian tribes at this point were organized around village communities. In the village, the land was common property, except the clan leaders had private land as well, and lakes and fishing waters were also common property of the village. Every few years, the villagers would redivide the fields and pasture lands so that each family would basically get the amount of land that they need. Like I said, the land was owned by the village, but it was redivided for use by separate families for a few years at a time. But gradually, first the land around their homes, and then later also the farmland became purely private property, and it was inherited by separate families. But distribution of land and reallocation of land also continued to take place for centuries. I believe in Russia this kind of collective land ownership only ended with the Stolypin land reform, which took place in 1901 to 1903. It was similar to the British Enclosure Act. While a lot of the farmland became private property, things like forests and meadows remained in common use, and all the villagers could freely use them. For instance, to forage and collect various kinds of things, chop wood, fish, and stuff like that. Thus, there arose a class of independent small peasants. However, the peasants were unable to preserve their independence for long, because as a result of private property, there emerged inequality between different members of the village, and eventually some farmers became richer and others became poorer. The rich peasants basically started to dominate the village. They started to acquire and concentrate more and more of the land into their control. And eventually these rich peasants, who often were also clan chiefs and local military leaders, they ended up becoming landowners who rented land, and other people then had to pay them rent. In this period, the tribal or clan system basically started to fully disintegrate. In the past, if people were members of the same tribe, they would all be taken care of, but at this point, that was out of the window. This was a full-blown class society, landowners would exploit other people even if they were members of the same clan. In order to maintain their power and keep the dependent peasants in check, the landowners had to create proper state power. A lot of these clan chiefs and clan warriors who had waged war on Rome, they had a retinue around them, and a retinue is basically just all their warrior buddies. They began to concentrate more and more of this military power around them so that these big clan chiefs could become kings, and their buddies, the retinue, basically became a new aristocracy and vassals under the king. Thus, a number of new states headed by kings were formed on the ruins of the Roman Empire. These new barbarian kings gave land to their retinue, to their friends, into private and hereditary possession, as a form of compensation for their military service and also to buy their loyalty. The church, which was also very important for propaganda purposes, so that these new kings could maintain their power and authority, also received land. So the king and the state, as well as the royal retinue, as well as the church and the monasteries, acquired huge land holdings. And these lands which the monarchy gave to the retinue and to the church to buy their loyalty and as a form of payment for their services were called fiefs or feuds, which is why this system was called feudalism. So the gradual process of all these private land holdings owned by small peasants being accumulated by large landowners and then the landowners turning all the peasants into serfs, that took place in Europe during the course of a number of centuries, from 5th or 6th to the 9th and 10th centuries. The textbook says that, quote, "The free peasantry was ruined by the incessant military service, plunder and impositions. Turning for help to the large landowner, the peasants converted themselves into his dependents. Frequently the peasants were compelled to yield themselves into the so-called protection of the feudal lord. Otherwise, it was impossible for a defenseless man to exist in conditions of ceaseless wars and bandit raids. In such cases, property rights in the plot of land passed to the feudal lord, and the peasant could work his plot only on condition of fulfilling various duties for the lord. In other cases, the royal lieutenants and officials, by means of deceit and force, appropriated the land of free peasants, making the latter acknowledge their power." Unquote. So basically in Rome, the slaves and a lot of the lumpen had been turned into colony, while people in Europe and on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, they had to put themselves under the protection of some local warlord to basically protect them from bandits and whatever, and they were also turned into serfs. In different countries, the process of feudalization took different courses, but the essence of the matter was everywhere the same. The formerly free peasants fell into personal dependence on the feudal lords who had seized their lands. Sometimes the dependence was weaker, sometimes stronger. Feudalism was an essential stage in the historical development of society. Slavery had outlived itself. In these circumstances, the further development of the productive forces was only possible on the basis of the labor of the mass of the dependent peasantry, possessing their own holdings, their own implements of production, and having some interest in labor. However, as history testifies, it is not obligatory that every people should pass through all stages of social development. For many peoples, conditions arise under which they have the possibility of missing one stage of development or another, and of passing immediately to a higher stage. In Russia, the lower stage of slavery or patriarchal slavery, when slavery was just a supplementary thing added on top of the tribal economy and it wasn't yet the whole basis of the economy, the patriarchal slavery arose when the primitive community was breaking down. And in Russia, patriarchal slavery existed for a long time, but it never developed into a full-blown slave economy. Instead, they went directly into feudalism. The reason why it happened like that in Russia and in the Slavic countries generally is that by the time the primitive community collapsed in these areas, the Roman Empire had already collapsed. So the Roman Empire and the region surrounding it, they were already moving to feudalism. and all the necessary requirements for feudalism already existed, so Russia just directly got those and skipped right to feudalism. In Russia, the church originally became the largest feudal landowner, as there wasn't a centralized Russian state until the 15th and 16th centuries. Originally in feudalism, the Russian peasants were not bound to the land fully, but instead they could be transferred from one lord to another. But this right was abolished in 1581 because the landowners wanted to intensify the exploitation of the peasants, and thus they were converted fully into serfs. Those are just some examples of how these small details were different in different countries. Different countries transitioned to feudalism at different times and at different speeds, but the same basic development still took place almost everywhere. During feudalism, agriculture was a predominant part of the economy, and its most important branch was tillage of crops, but the economy did become more varied over the course of centuries. In the early periods of feudalism, agricultural equipment was really bad. They used primitive wooden plows with an iron share, and they used sickles and scythes and spades. Later, the iron plow and harrow began to be used. The grinding of grain for a long time was carried out by hand, until wind and water mills later became widespread. The reason that feudalism was so essential is that at this point slavery had run into an impossible crisis and had become totally impracticable, but at the same time it was impossible to transition into anything better than feudalism, such as capitalism or socialism. And of course those people who were still at the stage of the primitive community, they would also eventually develop a class society, and they would either develop slavery and then pass to feudalism, or in some cases they could directly go to feudalism if they were able to get the prerequisites for feudalism from the outside ready-made, such as in the case of Russia and also in the case of Finland. Because Finland never had a developed system of slavery, Finland never had a state until feudalism was brought to Finland from the outside by the Crusades. Production relations of feudal society. Exploitation of peasants by feudal lords. The whole economic basis of feudalism is that the feudal landlord owned all the land, and he also had control over the serfs. The serfs were no longer slaves, so the landlord couldn't sell them. Technically he also couldn't kill them, but the serf was tied to the land, as they say, so the serfs couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't leave, they were forced to be there, and they had to pay tribute or some kind of rent to the landlord, and that's how the landlords basically got their wealth. However, other types of property that existed alongside the property of the feudal landlord was also the small private property of the serf, because the serf, unlike the slave, actually owned his own home, his own tools, his own food, and also the property of the craftsmen and merchants and those kinds of people. So those also existed. I already kind of talked about this in the previous episode, but the reason that serfdom was a superior form of economy compared to slavery was that it was possible to have better technology because the serfs were motivated to produce, as basically they needed to produce so that they could feed themselves and then pay rent. Otherwise they would be completely screwed. So they had a motivation to try to use their tools efficiently, try to improve technique, get better tools, and also they had to maintain their own tools themselves, while in slavery all the costs of maintaining everything always fell to the slave owner. The slave also had zero motivation. The only way to motivate a slave was to threaten them with violence. Almost in all cases, it also wasn't possible to give the slaves any good tools because the slaves could just get angry and break the tools as a form of sabotage. The slaves also didn't have the skills, and it didn't make any sense to try to educate slaves. And also during slavery, there was no real incentive to try to improve technology because there was no way to use it, and also why would you develop technology? You already had initially an infinite supply of slaves to do everything, so you didn't need technology. So serfdom and feudalism in general removed a lot of these hindrances and allowed for faster development of the productive forces and technology, even though the development was still extremely slow, but it was faster than during slavery. So let's get into some more Marxist economic concepts, such as necessary labor time and surplus labor time. The book mentions that the labor time of the serf was divided into necessary labor time and surplus labor time. It just basically means that during the necessary labor time, the serf is producing the value that it takes to maintain him and his family. So that's necessary. If that doesn't happen, he goes hungry and he'll eventually die. The surplus labor time is all the stuff he does on top of that. So the necessary labor time is necessary for his own maintenance. The surplus labor time is working on the landlord's land or producing things that the landlord can extract. However, the exploitation of the serfs was so severe that in order to pay the rent, it frequently also took some of the necessary labor time of the peasants, meaning that they and their families had to go hungry and be starving. The basis of feudal exploitation was not that the landowner owned the serf, but it also wasn't any kind of voluntary agreement or anything. No, it was based on direct domination, direct oppression, and the fact that the peasants who became serfs were absolutely at the mercy of the landlord. Feudal rent existed in three main forms: labor rent, rent in kind, and money rent. In all of these forms, the exploitation of the peasants was blatant. It was in an unconcealed form. This is different, for instance, from capitalism, because in capitalism the exploitation can often be, if not invisible, at least seemingly so convoluted that people don't really understand what's happening. I'll explain concretely what this looks like in feudalism. So the most primitive kind is labor rent. This means that the peasant pays the rent by working directly on the landlord's land or performing some kind of labor service for the landlord. This existed in the early stages of feudalism. In Russia it was called week work or barshina. In Finland it was called taksverkki, which comes from a Swedish word meaning day's work. Meaning that, for instance, let's say that your rent is 3 days. That means that out of 7 days of the week, on 3 days you have to work on the landlord's land. And you get no compensation for it. You just have to do it. And then the other 4 days you have for yourself. So you spend 3 days working on the landlord's land or doing something else for the landlord. So the peasants plowed, sowed, gathered the harvest, pastured cattle, worked as carpenters, chopped wood, transported agricultural produce, built buildings. They did everything for the landlord. So for 3 days of the week you would have to do that, and then 4 days of the week you could work on your own plot. Under this type of system, the serf, when he was working on his own land, he had a clear motivation to try to figure out, okay, how am I going to work as efficiently as possible? When they were working on the landlord's land, they didn't have such motivation. Instead, the feudal lords had to use tactics similar to slavery to basically make sure that the serfs are not slacking off when they're working on the landlord's land. And in this kind of system, the exploitation is extremely blatant because the exploitation happens in a different location than your normal work. So the serf wants to be working on his own plot, but he's forced to go to some other place, to the landowner's land, and then work there. Whereas in capitalism, it's not so blatant. You just go to work. You go to the same place. You can't perceive, well, is this necessary labor time right now, or is this surplus labor time right now? There's no way to easily tell. It doesn't feel any different. It doesn't look any different. It doesn't happen in a different place. But in feudalism, the exploitation was still completely blatant and unconcealed. And of course also in capitalism, you look for work and then you seemingly voluntarily get a job. Whereas in feudalism, that wasn't really the case. It was forced upon you. The second type of feudal rent was rent in kind, or quit rent, which meant that the peasant produced goods, and then he had to give a part of the goods to the landlord. And this was also often combined with remnants of labor rent. And obviously the switch from the earlier kind of rent to this happened very slowly over a course of centuries, but the advantage of this rent in kind was that the peasant became more independent. He could just focus on his own plot. either exclusively or at least more than in the past, and he had more of a motivation and more stimulus to raise the productivity of labor. And obviously, the landowner only cared about getting the stuff, so as long as he was getting more stuff, he was fine with this. So he was fine with the improvement in productivity. And then at the late stage of feudalism, when commodity exchange had already become comparatively widespread, there arose money rent, or quit rent in money. Money rent is characteristic of the period of the breakdown of feudalism and the appearance of capitalist relations. And various forms of feudal rent often existed simultaneously side by side, and that was also the case in Finland, where up until the Socialist Revolution of 1918 and even afterwards, all three of these types of rent existed side by side. There were also other kinds of payments that the serfs had to pay. For instance, the landowners usually had various monopolies, so there might be only one mill that everyone is allowed to use, and it's owned by the landowner, so nobody else is allowed to build a mill, or something else like a wine press. Nobody else is allowed to own a wine press, and then everybody is forced to use that one, and then pay a high premium for the use of it to the landlord. The state obviously also imposed taxes, and also the church imposed a tithe, which means that the peasants had to give 10% of all of their products to the church. So the church was making mad bank. They were absolutely loaded.